A single burst of shaking can reveal two very different failures, and that is what made this earthquake so unsettling. In Venezuela, high-rise apartment buildings folded downward into piles of concrete, barely higher than the lower floors that once held them up. A few miles away, along the edge of Trinidad, the sea seemed to pull back from a coastline that had suddenly risen out of the water. One event looked like a human disaster of weak construction. The other looked like the earth itself changing shape. But both stories point to the same uncomfortable truth. Earthquakes rarely create weakness from nothing. They expose what was already waiting to fail. On the 24th of June, northern Venezuela was hit by a violent double earthquake. First came a magnitude 7.2 shock. Just 39 seconds later, a stronger magnitude 7.5 rupture struck. Almost the same region. The second blow arrived before buildings, slopes, and people had any time to recover from the first. Across the country, the official death toll, cited in the aftermath, reached 1,943. More than 10,500 people were injured, and tens of thousands were reported missing beneath the rubble. Those numbers are hard to absorb, but the physical pattern behind them is even more important to understand, because it was not random. The most disturbing images came from apartment towers that did not simply crack, tilt, or lose a few outer walls. They pancaked floor after floor dropped almost straight down, turning tall buildings into compressed stacks of broken slabs. In some places, what had been a 20-story tower was reduced to rubble, less than 2 stories high. That type of collapse is one of the deadliest possible because it leaves almost no time for escape and very few survivable voids inside the debris. Almost immediately, people online began searching for one simple explanation. One viral clip showed rescuers scraping a light, porous-looking material from exposed concrete columns. It looked, to many viewers, like styrofoam. The conclusion spread fast. The towers must have fallen because they were filled with fake material instead of real structure. Others pushed back, and their objection made sense. If that material alone had been supporting the buildings, the towers would likely have failed long before the earthquake arrived. The truth was more technical and much more serious. The clearest clue came from comparing collapsed towers with damaged towers still standing. In several surviving structures, broken columns revealed visible steel reinforcement inside the concrete. That mattered. Another clip, showing a man running down a stairwell inside a swaying building, added to the picture. The higher levels seemed relatively intact at first, but as he descended, the damage became increasingly obvious. The problem was not only the concrete people could see, it was the steel they could not see, or in many cases, the steel that was too thin, too sparse, or poorly tied together to do its job. Concrete is excellent when weight pushes straight down on it. Under compression, it can carry enormous loads. But concrete has a dangerous weakness. It performs badly when it is pulled, bent, twisted, or shaken sideways. Under that kind of stress, it can crack suddenly and violently. Engineers call this brittle failure. It gives little warning, absorbs little energy, and can break in a way that looks almost explosive. Earthquake-resistant design tries to avoid brittle failure at all costs. The goal is to make a building behave in a ductile way, meaning it can bend, stretch, and absorb energy before it collapses. That is why steel reinforcement is so important. Rebar is not decorative. It is the flexible skeleton inside a concrete structure. Vertical bars help a column resist bending, while smaller steel hoops, often called ties, wrap around those bars and hold the core together. During strong shaking, the vertical steel tries to bend and stretch. The ties keep that steel from buckling outward and help confine the concrete core. If the ties are close enough and strong enough, the column may be badly damaged, but still hold long enough for people to escape. If the ties are too far apart or the steel is too weak, the column can split open and lose strength almost instantly. Investigators looking at the ruins in northern Venezuela reportedly found many columns with dangerously poor reinforcement. Some appeared to contain too little steel. Others had vertical bars that were too small and lateral ties spaced too far apart. There were also reports of non-ductile concrete, a mix made brittle by shortcuts, such as too much sand, too much water, cheap filler, or poor quality control. These details may sound like construction paperwork, but in an earthquake, they become the difference between a damaged building and a grave. The double quake made the situation worse in a very specific way. The first magnitude, 7.2 shock, likely cracked, and weakened columns that were already poorly reinforced. Brittle concrete fractured, outer layers broke away, and the thin steel inside lost support. Some buildings may have been standing after the first quake only because gravity had not yet found the final failure path. Then, 39 seconds later, the stronger magnitude, 7.5 shock arrived. The second wave hit columns that had already been wounded. With the concrete core damaged and the reinforcing cage unable to hold itself together, the columns could no longer carry the vertical load above them. Once the columns failed, gravity did the rest. Upper floors dropped onto the floors below, and each impact overloaded the next level in a chain reaction. That is, pancaking. It is fast, vertical, and brutally efficient. It also makes rescue extremely dangerous. Teams entering the ruins must search through unstable voids beneath tons of broken concrete, knowing that a strong aftershock could bring down whatever remains above them. The first disaster was not just the earthquake. It was the meeting of earthquake energy with buildings that had too little capacity to survive it. The most frustrating part is that this kind of failure is not new. Venezuela has seen damaging earthquake collapses before. Other earthquake-prone cities have faced the same lesson. Mexico City, after its earlier disasters, became a reference point for how stricter rules, better reinforcement, and more serious inspections can reduce the number of pancake buildings in later earthquakes. Chile and Japan offer the same basic lesson in different forms. Strong seismic codes matter, but enforcement matters even more. A good rule on paper does not hold up a column. Steel, inspection, and honest construction do. In places where economic crisis, corruption, unpermitted additions, or weak oversight take over, buildings can quietly accumulate risk for years. Extra floors may be added without proper review. Cheap materials may replace specified ones. Concrete may be poured with poor controls. Reinforcement may be reduced to save money. None of this necessarily looks dramatic before an earthquake. The building stands. People move in. Life continues. Then the ground shakes, and the hidden decisions inside the structure become visible all at once. That is the building side of the story. But while towers were collapsing on land, a second and stranger event was unfolding offshore. Near Trinidad and Tobago, footage began spreading of a coastline that appeared to have risen out of the sea in a matter of hours. Part of the southern coast was reportedly lifted by nearly 20 feet. Muddy ridges appeared where shallow water had been. Marine life, including crabs, fish, and large stingrays, was left stranded on newly exposed ground. It looked as if the ocean had retreated, but the real process was more complex. At first, many people assumed the main Venezuelan fault had ripped straight across the seafloor and pushed Trinidad upward like a giant tectonic block. That would be a dramatic explanation, but geologists found a more local and more unusual mechanism. Trinidad sits very close to Venezuela, along a complicated boundary between the Caribbean plate and the South American plate. These plates grind past each other slowly, storing stress over time. When the double earthquake released energy, the shaking did not stop neatly at the shoreline. Seismic waves traveled through the seafloor and reached weak, water-saturated coastal sediments. That matters, because saturated sediment can lose its strength during violent shaking. Normally, sand and clay grains press against each other tightly enough to behave like solid ground. Water fills the spaces between those grains, but the grains still carry the load. During an earthquake, shaking can rapidly increase the water pressure in those spaces. If that pressure gets high enough, the grains lose contact with each other for a short time. The ground behaves less like solid earth and more like thick liquid. This is liquefaction, and it can turn stable-looking land into moving ground. Along Trinidad's southern coast, The shaking appears to have struck exactly the kind of material most vulnerable to that process. Soft, saturated sediment near a slope. Once the sediment weakened, part of the coastal mass could slide toward deeper water. Imagine a giant underwater block shifting downward on one side as millions of tons of material move seaward. The opposite edge can pivot upward, the shoreline above. That edge rises, not because a tectonic plate has neatly lifted it like an elevator, but because a local landslide has levered part of the seafloor and coast upward. That explains why the change looked so sudden and so strange. People were not watching a slow, mountain-building process. They were seeing the aftermath of a rapid failure in soft ground. Water drained off the newly raised surface, and animals that had been swimming in shallow coastal water were trapped on mud. For the ecosystem, the shift was immediate. For the coastline, the map had changed in a matter of hours. Then the story became even more unusual. Geologists inspecting the uplifted area found fractures, smaller landslides, and bubbling pools. Thick black oil and natural gas were reportedly seeping from newly exposed cracks. That detail matters because this stretch of Trinidad's southern coast sits in a known mud volcano zone. Mud volcanoes are not volcanoes in the classic lava and ash sense. They are systems where pressurized water, gas, oil, and mud move upward through weak zones in the ground. They are already fluid, rich, unstable, and connected to faults. In other words, this was not strong rock being shaken evenly. It was a fragile, pressurized system being hit by a major nearby earthquake. There may also have been a resonance effect. Some reports suggest that a nearby mud volcano mound has a natural vibration period close to 28 seconds. The two Venezuelan quakes, only 39 seconds apart, may have produced a combined shaking rhythm that interacted strongly with that system. Resonance is the same reason a swing rises higher when each push arrives at the right moment. Random pushes do little. Timed pushes build motion quickly. Underground, a similar match between shaking and the natural rhythm of weak, fluid-loaded ground can amplify deformation and trigger movement that might otherwise have been smaller. To be clear, this was not a new lava volcano waking up beneath Trinidad. It was a mud volcano coastline, reacting violently to earthquake energy. It was also not the same kind of broad tectonic uplift seen in some subduction zone earthquakes, where vast coastal areas rise or sink because of movement on a major offshore fault. This appears to have been local ground failure, liquefaction, landsliding, fluid pressure, and weak sediment combining into one dramatic coastal change. Now, the two disasters begin to look less separate. In Caracas and other affected areas, the earthquake found buildings whose concrete columns were too brittle and whose steel reinforcement was too weak or too sparse. In Trinidad, the same shaking found coastal ground that was too soft, too wet, too pressurized, and too unstable. One failure was inside concrete. The other was inside mud and sediment. But the pattern was the same. Violent energy searched for the weakest link and broke it. That is what makes this disaster so important beyond Venezuela and Trinidad. The earthquake did not invent bad reinforcement inside a column. It revealed it. The earthquake did not create a mud volcano zone from nowhere. It activated a fragile system that already existed. For years, both weaknesses were mostly hidden. A building can look normal from the street, even if its columns are poorly detailed. A coastline can look stable, even if its buried layers are saturated and loaded with gas. The danger is not always visible until the stress arrives. This is the lesson that keeps returning after major earthquakes. We tend to describe them as natural disasters, and of course the shaking itself is natural. But the scale of the human disaster often depends on decisions made long before the fault ruptures. Was the building reinforced properly? Was the concrete tested? Were inspections independent? Were extra floors approved? Was the soil studied? Were unstable slopes mapped? Were known hazard zones treated seriously? Or did everyone quietly hope the ground would behave? A 39-second gap between two earthquakes turned hidden weakness into visible catastrophe. Towers collapsed because their columns could not bend and absorb energy. A coastline rose because soft, saturated fluid. Rich ground lost stability and shifted. Different materials, same warning. Earthquakes do not always give advance notice, but structures and landscapes often carry clues if anyone is willing to look closely enough. Whether the risk is steel missing from a column or mud and gas under a shoreline, inspection matters before the shaking starts. Once the ground begins moving, the time for paperwork is over.